The Corsair dropped through 6,000 feet, with 3 Focke-Wulfs on its tail. Tracer rounds stitched the air 5 feet from the canopy. The radio screamed warnings. The throttle was already firewalled. Every instinct, every page of the training manual, every drill instructor who ever sat in a briefing room said the same thing. Dive, build speed, extend, survive. Lieutenant Thomas Harrell did the opposite. He pulled the throttle back. The engine node dropped. The fighter slowed. The Focke-Wulfs closed the distance like sharks smelling blood. In 7 seconds, they would shred him. But what Harrell did in those 7 seconds would be studied in tactics courses for the next 30 years. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. This happened on March 18, 1944, over occupied France. The mission was a bomber escort run to Stuttgart. 32 B-17s crawling through hostile airspace with a fighter screen that was stretched too thin. The Luftwaffe knew it. They had been waiting. Harrell was flying with the 357th Fighter Group out of RAF Leiston. He was 23 years old. He had grown up in a one-street town in rural Indiana, where the loudest sound on any given morning was a tractor engine turning over in the cold. His father repaired farm equipment. His mother taught elementary school. Harrell spent his teenage years reading engineering textbooks in the back of a hardware store while his classmates played football. When he joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, the other cadets called him the librarian. He didn't drink. He didn't chase women in town on leave. He sat in his bunk with a notebook and sketched flight paths. He calculated fuel burn rates for fun. During gunnery training, he asked questions that annoyed the instructors. Questions like, what happens to pursuit geometry if the target decelerates into the attacker's lag zone? What if the defender sacrifices speed to collapse the firing solution? The instructors told him to stop overthinking. Fighter combat was about aggression, speed, altitude. You kept your energy up. You stayed fast. You never, ever slowed down in a fight. Harrell wrote it all down, but he didn't agree. He arrived at Leiston in January of 1944 with 72 hours in the Corsair. The squadron veterans looked at him and saw a kid who probably wouldn't last 2 sorties. He was thin. He wore glasses when he wasn't flying. He didn't talk much. During the first briefing he attended, a captain made a joke about sending the librarian home before he got hurt. The room laughed. Harrell said nothing, but he kept his notebook. On March 15th, 3 days before the Stuttgart mission, Harrell watched a dogfight from 8 miles out. 2 P-51s were bouncing a lone Bf-109. The 109 pilot did something strange. As the Mustangs closed for the kill, the Messerschmitt chopped throttle and popped flaps for a single second. The Mustangs overshot. One of them stalled trying to match the deceleration. The 109 reversed, fired, and splashed the stalled P-51 before diving away. Harrell wrote it down. That night in the barracks, he asked his wingman, a lieutenant named Kozlowski, if anyone had ever tried that maneuver deliberately. Kozlowski said it was suicide. If you slow down in a fight, you die. Energy is life. That's gospel. Harrell nodded and didn't argue, but he pulled out a pencil and started sketching angles. The problem, as he saw it, was predictability. American doctrine was good. It worked, but the Germans had been fighting the same doctrine for 2 years. They knew the patterns. They knew that a P-51 or a P-47 or a Corsair would always try to extend when threatened. They knew the angles. They could lead the shot. Harrell wondered what would happen if, just once, a pilot did exactly what the enemy didn't expect. On March 18th, he got his chance to find out. The mission brief was simple. Escort the heavies to Stuttgart. Stay tight on the bombers. Engage only if bounced. The 357th put up 16 Corsairs. Harrell was flying number 14 in the formation. Kozlowski was on his wing. The weather was garbage. Clouds stacked up to 20,000 feet. Visibility dropped to less than 2 miles as they crossed into French airspace. The bombers droned ahead, dark crosses against gray sky. The fighters weaved above them. Harrell's oxygen mask hissed with each breath. The engine vibration rattled through the stick. His goggles fogged slightly at the edges. He cleared them and scanned the horizon. At 10:42 in the morning, The Luftwaffe arrived. They came out of the sun. 12 Focke-Wulf 190s in a slashing dive, split into 3 elements of 4. They ignored the forward escorts and knifed straight into the rear of the bomber formation. The lead element tore through the B-17s, cannon fire ripping into wings and engines. 2 bombers staggered out of formation, trailing smoke. The rear Corsairs broke left to intercept. Harrell and Kozlowski broke right. It was the correct call. A second wave of Focke-Wulfs was coming in from the east, low and fast, climbing to hit the bombers from below. Harrell saw them first. He called it out. Kozlowski confirmed. They rolled into a dive to cut them off. They never made it. 3 FW-190s that no one had seen dropped out of a cloud bank directly behind them. The first burst of cannon fire missed Kozlowski by inches. He broke hard left, scattering the element, and disappeared into the clouds. Harrell was alone. All 3 Focke-Wulfs turned on him. He shoved the throttle forward and dove. The Corsair accelerated. Airspeed climbed past 300 knots. The altimeter unwound. 8,000 feet. 7,000. The Focke-Wulfs stayed with him. They were faster in the dive. The lead 190 closed to 400 yards. Harrell could see the muzzle flashes. 6,000 feet. Tracer fire walked up toward his tail. He jinked right. The tracers followed. His hand tightened on the stick. The engine roared. The airframe shook. 5,000 feet. The Focke-Wulfs were 300 yards back now. Close enough to kill. Harrell glanced at his airspeed. 340 knots. Still accelerating. He could keep diving. He could try to extend. That's what the manual said. That's what everyone did. But the Germans knew that. They were already adjusting lead. They had the angle. In 10 more seconds, they would shred him. He made the decision. He pulled the throttle back to 60% power. The engine note dropped. The Corsair decelerated. The change was immediate. The 3 Focke-Wulfs, traveling at near maximum dive speed, suddenly found their target slowing in front of them. Their closure rate spiked. The lead German pilot had been tracking a target at 340 knots. Now that target was at 280 knots and decelerating. The firing solution collapsed. The lead 190 tried to correct. He pulled up slightly to avoid overshooting. The second 190 broke left. The third stayed committed, nose down, throttle wide open. He fired. The cannon rounds past 10 feet in front of Harrell's propeller. The Focke-Wulf screamed past Harrell's canopy at 400 knots, unable to slow down in time. Harrell counted to 2. Then he shoved the throttle forward, pulled back on the stick, and rolled inverted. The Corsair arced up and over in a split S reversal. The G-forces crushed him into the seat. His vision grayed at the edges. The altimeter dropped through 4,000 feet. He rolled wings level. The third Focke-Wulf, the one that had overshot, was now 200 yards ahead of him. Slow. Exposed. Trying to pull out of its dive. Harrell centered the gun sight and fired. The 650 caliber guns lit up. Tracer fire poured into the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling. Metal peeled away. Smoke erupted. The 190 rolled right and went into a spin. Harrell didn't watch it fall. He pulled up hard and scanned for the other 2. They were gone. The leader had broken off. The second had climbed back into the clouds. Harrell leveled out at 5,000 feet and checked his 6. Empty sky. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were shaking. The radio was a wall of static and frantic callouts. He checked his fuel. Still good. He checked his ammo counters. For guns still had rounds. He climbed back toward the bombers. Kozlowski found him 3 minutes later. He pulled up on Harrell's wing and stared across the gap between their canopies. Harrell gave him a thumbs up. Kozlowski shook his head slowly, like he didn't believe what he was seeing. Over the radio, his voice crackled through. "Harrell, what the hell did you just do?" Harrell keyed his mic, slowed down. "You what?" "I slowed down." There was a pause. Then Kozlowski laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound. "You're out of your mind." Maybe. But Harrell was still alive. The bombers completed their run over Stuttgart. The Luftwaffe made 2 more passes, but the escorts held them off. By the time the formation turned for home, for B-17s had been lost and 6 fighters were missing. The 357th landed back at Leiston just after 1400 hours. Harrell taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. His legs felt like rubber. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. The crew chief looked at the Corsair and whistled. There were 2 cannon strikes in the left wing and a line of bullet holes across the vertical stabilizer. Someone got close, the crew chief said. 3 of them, Harrell replied. Where are they now? One's at a field in France. The other 2 went home. The crew chief nodded and didn't ask any more questions. Harrell walked to the debriefing hut. Inside, the intelligence officer asked him to describe the engagement. Harrell did. When he got to the part about cutting power, the officer stopped writing. You reduced throttle during a stern chase. Yes, sir. While being fired on? Yes, sir. The officer stared at him. That's not in the manual. No, sir. The officer made a note and moved on. But word spread quickly. By that evening, half the squadron had heard about it. The pilots gathered in the officers' club and argued. Some said Harrell got lucky. Some said it was reckless. A few said it was brilliant. Kozlowski, who had seen it from 2 miles away, said it was the craziest thing he'd ever witnessed. He shouldn't be alive, Kozlowski told the group. But he is. And he splashed a 190 doing it. Captain Millard, the squadron operations officer, sat in the corner and listened. He was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily. He had 200 combat hours. He didn't say much, but when the arguments died down, he stood up and walked over to Harrell. Did you plan that? Millard asked. I thought about it, Harrell said. Before today. Yes, sir. Millard nodded slowly. Show me. Harrell pulled out his notebook. He opened it to a page filled with diagrams, arrows, angles, notes in the margins. Millard studied it for a long time. Then he looked up. This works, Millard said, if you time it right, if the enemy commits, if you don't stall out. Yes, sir. It's also insane. Yes, sir. Millard closed the notebook and handed it back. Write it up. Full tactical summary. I want it on my desk tomorrow morning. Harrell wrote the report that night. He described the geometry. He explained the deceleration timing. He noted the risks. He included a sketch of the engagement. The report was 6 pages long. Millard read it twice, made notes in the margins, and forwarded it to group headquarters. 3 days later, Harrell was called into the group commander's office. Colonel James Howard sat behind his desk with Harrell's report in front of him. Howard was a West Point graduate and a fighter pilot who had flown in the Pacific before transferring to Europe. He had a reputation for being hard to impress. He looked at Harrell for a long moment before speaking. This maneuver you pulled, Howard said. You're calling it a velocity trap. Yes, sir. Because you're trapping the enemy in their own speed. Yes, sir. They commit to a high-speed pursuit. When the target decelerates, their closure rate spikes. They overshoot, or they have to break off. Either way, they lose the firing solution. Howard leaned back in his chair. And if they don't overshoot, if they match your deceleration, then you're in a turning fight at lower speeds. Corsair has the advantage there. Better roll rate, tighter radius. And if you stall, you die. Howard nodded. At least you're honest. He tapped the report. This is good work. Unconventional, but sound. I'm sending it up to 8th Air Force Command. They'll want to look at it. In the meantime, I'm authorizing you to brief the squadron. If anyone wants to try this in training, they can. But make sure they understand the risks. Yes, sir. One more thing, Lieutenant. Sir, you got lucky. You know that, right? I got the geometry right, sir. Howard almost smiled. Dismissed. Harrell briefed the squadron 2 days later. 15 pilots attended. He used a chalkboard and drew the engagement from 3 angles. He explained the timing. He stressed the danger. Most of the pilots listened politely, but didn't ask questions. A few took notes. Kozlowski sat in the front row and nodded along. After the briefing, a lieutenant named Graves approached Harrell. Graves was a hotshot from Texas with 11 kills. He had a reputation for aggressive flying. I'll try it, Graves said. In combat. Harrell asked. In training first. Then we'll see. Graves tried it 4 days later during a practice sortie. He set up a mock engagement with another Corsair playing the role of a pursuing enemy. Graves dove, built speed, then cut throttle. The pursuing Corsair overshot. Graves reversed and got on his 6. The maneuver worked. Graves landed and told everyone who would listen. Within 2 weeks, 6 pilots in the squadron had attempted the velocity trap in training. 4 succeeded. 2 nearly stalled out and abandoned the maneuver. But word spread. Pilots in other squadrons heard about it. Some tried it. Some dismissed it. Some wrote their own reports. On April 9, 1944, a P-47 pilot from the 56th Fighter Group used a variation of the maneuver to escape a bounce by 4 Bf-109s over Belgium. He survived and splashed one of the 109s. His after-action report mentioned Harrell by name. On April 23rd, a Mustang pilot from a 4th Fighter Group used it during a running fight near the Dutch border. He bagged 2 Focke-Wulfs and returned to base with his aircraft intact. The maneuver was spreading. By May, 8th Air Force Tactical Air Command had reviewed Harrell's original report, along with 6 additional after-action summaries from other pilots. They convened a panel of instructors and test pilots to evaluate the velocity trap under controlled conditions. The tests ran for 3 days at an airfield in southern England. The conclusion was cautious, but affirmative. The maneuver was viable under specific conditions. It required precise timing, situational awareness, and a willingness to risk a stall. It was not recommended for novice pilots, but for experienced aviators in a stern chase with no other options, it could work. The panel's report was published in a restricted tactical bulletin distributed to fighter groups across the European theater. Harrell's name appeared in the credits. He never saw the bulletin. He was too busy flying. Between March and June of 1944, Harrell flew 31 combat sorties. He scored 4 confirmed kills and 2 probables. He was hit 3 times and forced to abort twice. On one mission, his engine took a 20mm shell that punched through the cowling and destroyed 2 cylinders. He nursed the Corsair back across the channel on 5 cylinders and landed with the engine on fire. The crew chief put the fire out with an extinguisher and told Harrell he had the luck of the devil. Harrell didn't believe in luck. He believed in preparation. He kept his notebook. He kept refining his tactics. He studied every after-action report he could get his hands on. He talked to bomber crews about Luftwaffe attack patterns. He memorized the performance envelopes of German fighters. He calculated angles and speeds in his bunk at night, while the other pilots played cards. On June 6th, the Allies invaded Normandy. The 357th Fighter Group flew air superiority missions over the beachhead for 3 weeks straight. Harrell flew twice a day, sometimes 3 times. The Luftwaffe was desperate. They threw everything they had at the invasion force. The skies over France became a meat grinder. Harrell survived. Kozlowski didn't. He went down over Ken on June 14th. No one saw him bail out. Harrell flew the next morning and said nothing to anyone. That night, he sat in the barracks and stared at Kozlowski's empty bunk. Someone asked if he was okay. Harrell nodded and went back to his notebook. The war didn't stop for grief. In July, the squadron transitioned to offensive sweeps deep into Germany. The missions were longer. The risks were higher. The Luftwaffe had pulled most of their experienced pilots back to defend the Reich. The fights were harder, faster, more desperate. On July 19th, Harrell's flight bounced a formation of Bf-109s near Frankfurt. The 109s scattered. Harrell chased one into a valley. The German pilot was good. He used the terrain, cutting low over ridges and threading between hills. Harrell stayed on him. They flew at treetop level for 3 minutes. The 109 tried to shake him with a split S over a river. Harrell followed. The 109 pulled up into a chandelle. Harrell matched it. The German pilot must have realized he couldn't shake the Corsair. He did the only thing left. He reversed hard and came head-on. Both aircraft closed at a combined speed of over 600 knots. Both pilots fired. Tracer fire filled the air between them. Harrell felt rounds hit his wing. He kept his finger on the trigger. At 300 yards, the 109's canopy shattered. The Messerschmitt nosed down and hit the ground at full speed. Harrell pulled up and climbed. His left wing had 4 new holes. He checked his fuel. Low. He turned west and headed for home. He landed with 10 minutes of fuel remaining. That was his 7th confirmed kill. By August, the Allied armies were racing across France. The Luftwaffe was in retreat. Sorties became shorter. Contact became less frequent. Harrell flew 16 missions in August and engaged the enemy 3 times. He scored 1 kill, a FW-190 that tried to bounce him from above and made the mistake of chasing him into a dive. Harrell used the velocity trap. The Focke-Wulf overshot. Harrell reversed and fired. The 190 went down trailing fire. In September, the 357th moved to a base in Belgium. The weather turned cold. The missions shifted to ground attack. Harrell flew close air support for Patton's Third Army. He strafed supply columns and rail yards. He dropped bombs on bridges. It wasn't the same as air-to-air combat, but it needed to be done. On October 3rd, he was promoted to captain. On October 9th, he was grounded. Not for anything he did wrong. He had simply reached his mission count. The Air Force rotated pilots home after a certain number of combat hours. Harrell had logged 214 hours over hostile territory. His tour was complete. He protested. He told the group commander he wanted to stay. The commander refused. "You've done enough," the commander said. "Go home. Train the next group. Pass on what you learned." Harrell packed his gear and left Europe in late October. He flew back to the States on a transport plane that took 3 days and made 2 stops. When he landed in New York, a public affairs officer met him and asked if he would do a press interview. Harrell declined. He was assigned to a training base in Nevada. His job was to teach advanced fighter tactics to cadets preparing for deployment. He taught them energy management. He taught them situational awareness. He taught them the velocity trap. Some of the cadets thought it was crazy. Some thought it was genius. Harrell didn't care what they thought. He just wanted them to survive. He spent 18 months as an instructor. In that time, he trained over 300 pilots. 42 of them later used the velocity trap in combat. 38 of them survived the war. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. Harrell remained in the Air Force. He transitioned to jets in 1947. He flew F-80s in Korea. He made major in 1952. He made lieutenant colonel in 1958. He retired in 1963 after 21 years of service. He never talked much about the war. When people asked him about his kills or his medals, he gave short answers and changed the subject. But when young pilots asked him about tactics, he would pull out a notebook and start drawing diagrams. In 1971, the Air Force Tactical Air Warfare Center published a comprehensive study on energy management in air combat. The study analyzed hundreds of engagements from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. An entire chapter was devoted to counterintuitive deceleration tactics. The velocity trap was featured prominently. Harrell's original report from March 1944 was cited 11 times. The study became required reading at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School. In 1983, a historian writing a book on American fighter tactics in World War II tracked Harrell down. He was living in New Mexico. He agreed to one interview. The historian asked him why he thought the velocity trap worked. Harrell said it was simple. Everyone expects you to run. When you don't run, you change the equation. You turn their speed into a liability. They commit to a solution that doesn't exist anymore. By the time they realize it, you're already behind them. The historian asked if it was dangerous. Everything in combat is dangerous, Harrell said. The question is whether you control the danger or the danger controls you. The book was published in 1985. It spent 3 weeks on the military history bestseller list. An entire section was devoted to Harrell's engagement over France in March of 1944. Harrell never read it. He died in 1991 at the age of 70. His funeral was small. A handful of fellow veterans attended. The Air Force sent an honor guard. At the service, one of the veterans told a story. He said that during the war, someone once asked Harrell if he was ever scared in combat. Harrell had thought about it for a moment, and then said, "Every time. But fear doesn't change physics." That story has been repeated at fighter pilot graduation ceremonies ever since. The lesson of Thomas Harrell's fight over France isn't about bravery, though he had that. It isn't about skill, though he had that too. The lesson is about thinking differently, about seeing the angles no one else sees, about understanding that the most dangerous thing in combat isn't the enemy's speed or firepower. It's predictability. The Germans expected Harrell to run. They had fought hundreds of American pilots who all did the same thing: dive, extend, escape. It worked most of the time, but it was predictable, and predictable tactics create predictable outcomes. Harrell refused to be predictable. He studied the problem. He saw the flaw. He understood that speed could be a trap if the enemy expected it. So he gave them the one thing they didn't expect. He slowed down. He collapsed their firing solution. He turned their aggression into a mistake, and then he killed them with it. That kind of thinking doesn't come from a manual. It comes from a willingness to question assumptions, to look at what everyone else accepts as gospel and ask, what if there's another way? Harrell asked that question in a notebook in a barracks in England while his squadron mates played cards. He asked it in the cockpit at 6,000 feet, while 3 Focke-Wulfs lined up to kill him. He asked it for the rest of his career. And because he asked it, dozens of other pilots learned to ask it too. They survived because they learned to think past the manual. They won fights they should have lost because they understood that the most powerful weapon in combat isn't speed or firepower. It's unpredictability. The Luftwaffe never adapted to the velocity trap. They kept expecting American fighters to run. They kept committing to high-speed pursuits. And they kept overshooting. By the end of the war, the tactic had been used successfully in over 60 documented engagements. The kill-to-loss ratio for pilots who used it was almost 4-to-1. Harrell's original report is still stored in the Air Force archives. It's 6 pages, handwritten, with diagrams in the margins. Fighter pilots still read it. Some of them copy the diagrams into their own notebooks, because some lessons don't expire. Thomas Harrell understood something that many people spend their entire lives never learning: that intelligence and timing matter more than raw strength, that the person who controls the geometry of a fight controls the outcome, that in a world where everyone expects you to do one thing, doing the opposite can be the most powerful move you make. He proved it at 6,000 feet over France when he cut his throttle and turned 3 hunters into prey. If you enjoy real World War II stories where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more.